Good afternoon. Welcome and thank you for joining us today for what I'm sure will be a great and very informative discussion on U.S. China Japan policy. My name is Natalie Armbruster. I'm a research associate here at Defense Priorities, a think tank based in Washington, D.C. that works to elevate and operationalize foreign and security policy based in realism and restraint. Today, I'm excited to moderate our discussion today about U.S. interests in the Asia-Pacific, the role of U.S. allies such as Japan to promote stability in the region, and the current tensions surrounding Taiwan after Speaker Pelosi's recent trip. I'll be joined today by Defense Priorities' own Dr. Lyle Goldstein and our guest, Dr. Mike Mochizuki from George Washington University. Professor Lyle Goldstein is the director of the Asia Engagement Program here at Defense Priorities. He's also currently a visiting professor at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University. Previously, he served for 20 years as a research professor at the U.S. Naval War College, where he founded and led the China Maritime Studies Institute and was awarded the Superior Civilian Service Medal for this achievement. Professor Goldstein has published 7 books on Chinese strategy, including his most recent book, Meeting China Halfway, as well as numerous scholarly articles and op-eds. Professor Goldstein received his PhD from Princeton, his master's from Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies, his bachelor's from Harvard, and he is fluent in both Chinese and Russian. We also welcome today Professor Mike Mochizuki, one of the leading experts of Japanese foreign and security policy in the U.S. He currently serves as the Associate Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at George Washington University, where he serves as the Japan-U.S. Relations Chair in memory of Gaston Seeger at the Elliott School of International Affairs, and co-directs the Memory and Reconciliation in the Asia-Pacific Project at the Seeger Center. Previously, he has held roles such as the director of the Seeger Center at the Asian Studies from 2001 to 2005, senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and co-director of the Center for Asia-Pacific Policy at RAND. Professor Mochizuki has also written and edited numerous books, including his most recent one, Memory, Identity, and Commemorations of World War II, Anniversary Politics in the Asia-Pacific. Professor Mochizuki received his PhD from Harvard, his bachelor's from Brown, and he is fluent in Japanese. Let me first thank you both for participating today. Now I will invite our speakers, in the order in which I introduce them, to tee off our discussion with some preliminary remarks where we dive into what I hope will be a very lively Q&A. While I will be guiding our Q&A, I encourage both of our speakers to feel free to probe each other and ask each other their own questions at any point during our discussion. With that, over to Lyle for his opening remarks.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. Thanks, Natalie, for moderating. And I just want to, as emphatically as I can, thank Professor Mochizuki for taking the time to join us here at Defense Priorities. Professor Mochizuki is somebody I most admire in the field, so we're thrilled that he can be with us today and share some thoughts. I know he's been in the region recently, so I'm going to try to keep my remarks kind of on the short side to give extra attention really to his perspective here, as he is also much more expert on the Japan angle that we hope to cover a lot today. But just a few thoughts that I'll salt in on the crisis as I've observed it. People calling it the fourth Taiwan Strait crisis. That in itself is very disturbing. I regretted very much that the speaker chose this time to make the trip. I thought it was utterly reckless, to use Tom Friedman's words. I think I was not alone in that assessment. Apparently this was basically the view of the administration and also the Pentagon. There are many reasons to think that China will not use force against Taiwan, not least that it has some big internal issues and big events coming up on Beijing's calendar, like the Major Party Congress. Also, I think we may talk a little bit about the impact of the Ukraine war. I think China has been rightly very sobered by Russia's experience so far in fighting Ukraine. On the other hand, there are many reasons to think that China will use force against Taiwan. I'm afraid that does seem to be the case. And some of these could also be related to the Ukraine war. That is, to the extent that Ukraine fatigue may exist in the West. But also, I'm very concerned that a lot of these same weapon systems, Javelin, HIMARS, and so forth, that as these are being sent to Taiwan as well, that China may see a kind of clock ticking, that it may think it needs to use force before all these weapons are in Taiwan's hands. Now, as I see the Taiwan military situation, there are many scenarios we could discuss. A show of force. We just saw a show of force, but a limited use of force, against the Penghus, Pratas Island, for example. But today in the New York Times, there's a big article about the blockade scenario. I think that's one we have to take very seriously. Although I also think we need to take the invasion scenario seriously also. And that article, I think, was a bit dismissive there. But I think China is mostly ready for an invasion. That's my view. We can discuss that. We can talk about Taiwan's options in this situation. Much talk today about Taiwan turning itself into a porcupine. There are many lessons from Ukraine to apply in that respect as well, of course. But we should also talk some about U.S. policy. And here, I think, we've got to keep in mind the imperative to avoid a great power war. To me, we have to keep that first and foremost in our mind. I think Taiwan is really the worst place in the Asia Pacific to draw red lines. So I'm advising U.S. leaders to exercise extreme caution with respect to Taiwan. Try to maintain the status quo, and that also means safeguarding the One China policy as well, which I think has been deprecated in over the course of the last 5 years. So I think we have to return our attention to adding substance to that One China policy and treat this with extreme caution. So let me wind up there and pass the mic here to Professor Mochizuki.
Well, thank you very much. I want to express my gratitude to Defense Priorities for organizing this program and inviting me to speak. I've been a longtime fan of Professor Goldstein's work on China and on Russia, and I've learned a great deal from him. And so I'm delighted and honored to be on this program with Professor Goldstein. I just returned from Japan. I spent about 2 weeks in Japan, and the purpose of my visit was to attend a conference celebrating the 50th anniversary of the normalization of relations between China and Japan, which took place in 1972. And this conference was really supposed to be a celebratory affair. But I must say that in the 2.5 years that I've been away from Japan, the mood in Japan has changed dramatically. During my last trip to Japan, the Japanese had extended support to China regarding the pandemic, and it looked like there was a great deal of warm ties between Japanese and Chinese, and the Chinese appreciated the Japanese help. But in the 2.5 years, the Japanese attitude towards Japan has turned negative, so dramatic that this conference was a very sober deliberation. The other thing is that soon after I arrived in Japan, former Defense Minister Ishiba and a group of Japanese politicians visited Taiwan, and there was a lot of discussion in the press and among my friends about that trip. And then in the tail end of my stay in Japan, Speaker Pelosi had gone to Taiwan, and China responded with the missile tests, and some of the missiles landed in the exclusive economic zone of Japan. And it was clear to me that because of this, the notion that former Prime Minister Abe had made that a Taiwan contingency is a Japan contingency was something that got a lot of play in Japan. But at the same time, I would have to say that no one, absolutely no one that I spoke to, thought that the trip by Nancy Pelosi was a good thing. Even those that really are very much supportive of Taiwan, they felt that the trip basically undermined Taiwan's security. But nevertheless, because Prime Minister Kishida is so focused on maintaining the good relationship with the United States and being part of the West, unlike President Yoon of South Korea, he had to graciously welcome and meet Speaker Pelosi. So during the trip, I was able to get a sense of how the Japanese were thinking about Taiwan. And this really mattered at this point in time because the Japanese are now in the middle of a debate and developing what is their next national security strategy. And some of the discussion has been about how much of an increase in defense expenditures there should be. And the Liberal Democratic Party has established 2% of GDP within 5 years. So in other words, doubling the Japanese defense budget within 5 years. Another issue that was being talked about a lot was whether or not Japan should develop a counter-strike capability and how that counter-strike capability ought to be used. And all of this really was about Taiwan. And the conclusion that I drew from my discussions in Japan is that Taiwan now presents the greatest strategic conundrum facing Japan since the end of World War II. Now, Japan, for a variety of reasons, prefers the status quo. It wants good economic relations with mainland China and with Taiwan. It has a political affinity towards Taiwan. And for security reasons, they would prefer that Taiwan remain separate from China, because if Taiwan became part of China, there's a fear that China could use Taiwan strategically to undermine Japanese security interests. But the problem for Japan is that the cross-strait status quo has become more fragile and probably less sustainable. In part, this has to do with the changes in Taiwan's domestic politics and a growing sense among Taiwanese that they are Taiwanese and not Chinese. And on top of that, China's power is growing, and China may in the future feel that it has a viable military option for reunifying Taiwan with China. But at the same time, the Japanese understand the cost of a military conflict would be enormous. And I think next to Taiwan, the country that would have the most to lose in a Taiwan conflict would be Japan and of course, China. And the Japanese are caught in a strategic dilemma. They're caught in a U.S. China competition. Although Japan is an ally of the United States, they don't want to have to choose between the United States and China. And they would prefer to have some guardrails in the U.S. China competition. But the problem is they don't know how to create those guardrails. Then the other thing that I heard was that the Ukraine-Russia war has complicated and worsened the strategic situation for Japan. Now, of course, formally, Japan has embraced NATO and has supported the West in terms of the sanctions against Russia. But this has led to the nightmare for Japan, which Prime Minister Abe wanted to avoid. Prime Minister Abe was very much concerned that China and Russia might increasingly cooperate on the security front to the detriment of Japanese interests. And therefore, despite the tensions in U.S.-Russia relations, Prime Minister Abe persistently courted Vladimir Putin to try to reach a compromise on the Northern Territories dispute and sign a peace treaty. But because of the Ukraine-Russia war, the prospect of any kind of peace treaty with Russia is now gone until at least Vladimir Putin is no longer the leader of Russia. And now, when Japan was thinking about concentrating on the China threat in the south, now Japan is concerned about a threat from the north, not just from Russia, but as a result of Russia-Chinese cooperation. And so now you have a two-front situation of having to focus on the security in the south and security in the north. And then on top of that, there's a feeling that in the wake of the Ukraine-Russia war, both Russia and China may have less incentive to try to restrain North Korea. And so in the end, it kind of creates a three-front security problem for Japan. So it's in this context that the Japanese are struggling to try to figure out what kind of policy Japan should take regarding Taiwan. And during my stay in Japan, there was a high-profile crisis simulation about Taiwan that involved many of the defense policy community, politicians, and former bureaucrats, and also former members of the self-defense force. And it was clear from these crisis simulations that there aren't any really good solutions for Japan. So let me just end by looking at what might be the policy options that Japan has regarding Taiwan. And the one dimension is, of course, declaratory policy. A second dimension is in terms of Japan's defense capabilities and doctrine. And then finally, in terms of diplomacy. In terms of declaratory policy, I think Japan basically has three broad options. Either one option is to be neutral regarding the Taiwan question. But the problem with neutrality is, this might be a good way for Japan to step out from being a party to a Taiwan conflict. But this would severely strain the relationship with the United States. So I don't think there's much support in Japan for neutrality. The other extreme is for Japan to move towards a position of strategic clarity. In terms of declaratory policy, they will state up front that the Japanese would allow the United States to use its military assets in Japan in a Taiwan contingency, and Japan would be willing to provide at least rear area support to help the United States defend Taiwan. But the problem with strategic clarity is that this is the sort of position that would destroy the stable relationship between Japan and China. So as a default, there is the position of strategic ambiguity, and Japan would be ambiguous towards Beijing, towards Taipei, and towards Washington about whether or not Japan would actually get involved in a Taiwan military contingency. The other dimension is in terms of defense capabilities and doctrine. And some Japanese are arguing that the Japanese need to pursue a policy of offensive denial. In other words, to have the counterattack capabilities to strike at the mainland of China, to try to degrade China's missile capabilities and Air Force capabilities so that China would not be able to strike Japan. So this offensive denial would be after an initial strike against Japan during a Taiwan conflict, and then Japan would go after mainland targets. The problem with that is that the Japanese have a hard time answering the question, what next? Because China would have the geographic advantage and the capability to retaliate and many of the self-defense force bases in Japan could be hit, and the war would certainly escalate. Some are beginning to think about maybe the nuclear option, that the way Japan could prevent a Chinese attack against Japan during the Taiwan scenario is for Japan to develop nuclear weapons. And there's a certain logic to this. Nuclear weapons could deter the Chinese, but it's not guaranteed. And it could also increase the danger of nuclear escalation. And also very important is the fact that the current Prime Minister Kishida, is trying to revitalize the agenda of nuclear disarmament. So it really cuts against the grain of Japanese politics. As again, kind of as a default position, Japan could pursue a policy of defensive denial, which is basically Japan would invest in capabilities to defend Japan's territory and to survive Chinese missile attacks. And this would very much fall within the current rubric of a strictly defensive defense doctrine. But even under defensive denial, Japan would have to make major investments in defense capabilities, including long-range standoff missiles. So I personally think that none of these options are perfect, but that the one that makes most sense for the Japanese is to have a declaratory policy of ambiguity and a defense doctrine of defensive denial. But at the end of the day, military deterrence is never sufficient to prevent a Taiwan conflict. And so the Japanese really need to focus on not just how Japan would respond if a conflict were to occur, but how to prevent a conflict. And here I think that Japan really has only one choice that makes sense. I mean, of course, they could try to accommodate and appease China and accept China's sphere of influence. But I think the Japanese body politic is so negative towards China and that they're unwilling to do that. And this would also strain the alliance with the United States. The other option, of course, is to clearly align with the United States and join the United States in containing Chinese influence. But then that leads to a confrontational stance with China, which the Japanese want to avoid. So I believe that diplomacy is critical for Japan, and the only sane option is for Japan to lead the way in what I would call middle power diplomacy, because all of the countries on the periphery of China want to avoid a Taiwan conflict. They all want to have stable relations with China while also encouraging the United States to remain in Asia. And so I believe that the best option for Japan is a combination of strategic ambiguity about Taiwan, a defense doctrine of defensive denial, and being much more proactive in terms of middle power diplomacy. Thank you.
Thank you both for that. I'm going to start with a very broad question for both of you, and then we'll get into personalized questions. And we also have great questions from our audience that I'm going to try to work in. So most recently, President Biden, other high-level officials have had several rhetorical gaffes that have raised doubt about the U.S. commitment to the longstanding one China policy and our overall strategy of strategic ambiguity. How important is it to U.S. security and the security of our partners, as well as regional stability, to continue to maintain these policies? And what would the implications be if China, Taiwan, or Japan seriously believed that the U.S. was wavering from this commitment? Allow first.
Okay. Yeah. I think this is a great setup for the discussion because it's, to me, as I understand the history, really, this was the bedrock compromise that Kissinger and Nixon developed to create the foundation for successful U.S. China relations. And remember, Kissinger, I think, went in was it 71, and then Nixon followed in early 72. We just had the 50th anniversary. But it wasn't until 79 that actually we had the establishment of formal relations. What were they arguing about for those 5 years? I think it was all about this issue of Taiwan and how that to what extent the U.S. would walk the walk on the one China policy. So to my estimate, we had better hold that at the center of our China policy in general. I think we lost our way on that really many years ago. But, to me, this crisis has been unfolding steadily, really, over the past 5 years. Maybe we can date it from when President-elect Trump talked with Tsai Ing-wen, but there were so many instances that, to me, we've kind of denigrated the policy over time, and this has caused the Beijing to take a really hostile approach. It didn't have to be this way, in my view. We could adhere to this policy with conviction. And I could flesh that out if you want, but look back to the administrations of Roosevelt and Truman, and both of them are on record saying Taiwan is part of China. So to me, we had better get back to that. And I don't think China wants to fight a war over Taiwan, certainly not with the United States or Japan. And so the way forward is relatively simple, but it argues for getting back to the core principles that we established U.S.-China relations on way back when.
I would agree completely with Lyle on that point. But I would also have to acknowledge that in Japan, there are some forces that want to push Japan away from its own version of the one China policy. Now, the wording is somewhat different in the Japanese one China policy. The one China policy was developed during the 1972 normalization process between China and Japan, and the Japanese both acknowledges and respects the Chinese position that there is one China, and Taiwan is part of China, but as the United States has kind of chipped away at the one China policy, there have been some conservative politicians in Japan that have also been trying to chip away. And I think this is a very dangerous dynamic. So, I'm not sure whether Chinese will believe that both the United States and Japan is still committed to the one China policy. But I think one way of trying to convince China of that fact is for the Japanese to try to get the United States to agree to include this point in a U.S.-Japan communique. So every year there's the so-called 2+2 meetings that involve the defense and foreign ministers of both countries, Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense on the U.S. side, the Japanese defense minister and the foreign minister on the Japanese. And in the recent statements, there's been a clause stating that Japan and the United States have an interest in peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. And, of course, we're all for peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. But I think it would also be meaningful if the two countries could state in that document the one China policy, and to be explicit that the United States and Japan does not support the independence of Taiwan. This has been stated verbally to the Chinese, but to have it in a bilateral U.S.-Japan public document I think would be quite meaningful in trying to reduce some of the tensions.
Thank you both. The next question I have is for Professor Goldstein. You talked in your opening remarks about this clock ticking that China believes that while we're sending weapons to Taiwan, there's a clock ticking, and if they are delivered, this may accelerate their timeline. Does this mean that as the U.S. gets more involved, we may be speeding up exactly what we don't want to happen? And what are the repercussions of us becoming more involved, spending more on Taiwan, and shifting towards this pattern that we have of claiming more and more support that we may not be willing to do?
Yeah, thanks, Natalie. I think this is an unrecognized problem. I mean, we have, with people looking at the Ukraine conflict, and we have good evidence that these weapons are quite effective, maybe even more than we thought. By the way, Asia specialists were very familiar with this term HIMARS well before it became famous in Ukraine. It's been, in fact, arguably the weapon was created for the purpose of coping with a China threat to Taiwan. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Japanese self-defense forces have a kind of HIMARS equivalent that they're busy working on and equipping in the kind of southern islands near China. So, and of course, China has been watching all of this extremely carefully. And like I said, I do think Chinese leaders are probably, to some extent, sobered by the reality of real war, how bloody it is, how difficult it is to control, etc. On the other hand, and we can get into this more, but China has many advantages that Russia did not, including, by the way, the ability to quite easily cut off Taiwan. So, even if there were some javelins, stingers, HIMARS, etc. on the island, do you think that Taiwan would be able to be resupplied in a conflict? I don't think so. In other words, it would have to depend entirely on what is there, because the Chinese Navy is more than capable of cutting off, and the Chinese Air Force as well, of cutting off any kind of resupply routes. So I'm very concerned about this. And, unfortunately, these weapons are so potent that, I think it's reasonable that China may have, is watching the numbers of these weapons, watching that they're flowing to Ukraine. By the way, many of these deliveries to Taiwan delayed because weapons are flowing to Ukraine, and Chinese strategists could well be saying to themselves, we're not going to wait for the day that Taiwan is turned into a fortress. We're going to attack now while we have the advantage, and before Taiwan has a large amount of HIMARS, javelins, stingers, et cetera, et cetera. And indeed, my assessment is that Taiwan today is very vulnerable.
Lyle, you briefly mentioned this, but I hope you can elaborate on this. I think everyone was sufficiently surprised by Russia's lackluster performance in Ukraine, and you touch on the fact that you believe that China is in a different position should they invade Taiwan. What kind of tools do you see being in China's toolbox that play to their advantage that would lead to this more advantageous position than what Russia saw in Ukraine?
Well, I mean, I don't want to take too much time on this Ukraine analogy. It's fascinating, but I do think it can mislead a little bit. And I'm afraid some people may be convinced that the Chinese military is very similar to the Russian military. But actually, I think the situations are quite different. And, I don't minimize these 90 miles of water that China has to cross. But, just a couple of things people have to keep in mind here. That is, Taiwan is about 1/15 the size of Ukraine. It's a little island. Okay. Ukraine is about the size of France. So to gobble up Ukraine was always going to be extremely challenging. And indeed, Russia has succeeded, I think, in now gobbling about 20%. Well, do the math. That would, a proportionate increase in terrain would have Taiwan pretty much conquered. But more than that, the Russian military has been in a tough spot for many, many years, all kinds of difficulties, accidents, and so forth. China's military is in a rather different place. And indeed, China's military budget is about 5 times that of Russia. So let's imagine about 5 times the amount of firepower going into 1/15 the area, and you get some idea of the kind of devastating firepower preparation that would accompany this campaign. I think China's indeed learned many, many lessons, from this conflict. But I think, this may indeed mean that China is more ready. But one of those lessons is that wars have tremendous costs in terms of blood and treasure. And unfortunately, I think China knew that already and has been preparing accordingly.
Now, I want to pose a similar question to Professor Mochizuki about defense spending. Japan has maintained an informal threshold of about 1% of its GDP on defense for over 50 years. However, in response to Chinese, North Korean, and Russian threats, as you mentioned earlier, they're willing to adopt 2% or up to 5%. Are they also aggravating exactly what they hope to avoid by increasing their defense spending and increasing their involvement in China?
First of all, the 2% of GDP spending on defense is a target, and it's not a policy. And my sense is that it's a very ambitious target. I mean, they want to increase it to 2% of GDP within 5 years. That would mean that every year Japan's defense budget would probably have to increase more than 10%, if not around 14%. And even during the Abe years, Japan's defense budget only increased at an annual rate of about 1% or 2%. So this is a major acceleration. And although the Liberal Democratic Party has established this as the target, I've heard that the Ministry of Finance is very concerned about the growing public deficit. So they're wondering, where is this money going to come from? Social expenditures are continuing to increase. The Japanese need to invest in revitalizing the economy. So although the Japanese understand that security is more important and they need to increase their defense expenditures, I'm not sure that they can reach 2% of GDP within 5 years, maybe within 10 years. And then the other thing you have to remember is that the current government is a coalition government, and one of the coalition partners is the Komeito, which is a very pacifist political party, and they will also provide some breaks on defense spending. And now I know that there are some American commentators who are talking about 3% of GDP, but that is really kind of fantasy land. Now, the other thing that the Japanese would say is that, how can China complain about Japan increasing its defense budget when the Chinese have been increasing their defense spending, and they now have such overwhelming military superiority over Japan? And so in a sense, it's not Japan that is aggravating the problem, but it's really the Chinese, and the Japanese are basically deciding to do something about it. So my prediction is that, yeah, there will probably be a moderate increase in defense spending. It may be eventually about 1.5 to 1.8% of GDP, which would be very much in line with the current spending of NATO. And then, as NATO countries move towards 2% of GDP, then maybe Japan in the next decade will get to that figure.
And just for our audience, what steps can Japan even do under Article 9 of their own constitution that basically renounces war altogether? What is reasonable to even expect from Japan, regardless of willingness or regardless of what they should be doing? What even can they do under this?
Right. Well, thanks very much for that question. And I believe there's a lot of kind of confusion in the United States about the constitutional constraints. and what Prime Minister Abe did in 2014 and 2015 to relax those constraints. So the Japanese government since the 1950s have interpreted Article 9 of the Constitution as stating that Japan does not have the right of belligerency, but Japan has the right of individual self-defense. And their argument is that no constitution can prohibit a country from actually trying to defend itself. And so that's how they kind of flexibly interpreted Article 9 of the Constitution. But at the same time, in the 1950s, the Japanese government stated that although Japan has the right of collective self-defense as well as the right of individual self-defense, as noted in the United Nations Charter, because of Article 9, Japan cannot exercise the right of collective self-defense. So that meant that if the United States were attacked, or if the Republic of Korea were attacked, Japan could not use force to defend the United States or defend the Republic of Korea. Japan can only use force to defend itself. And so then in 2014, Prime Minister Abe reinterpreted the Constitution and came up with this concept of survival threatening situations. So if there is an attack on a country with which Japan has a close relationship, or on the military forces of that country, then Japan could possibly use force in response to that because it could threaten the very survival and the livelihood and the freedom of the Japanese people. And based on that reinterpretation of the Constitution, the Abe administration passed an ambitious legislative package that overhauled the security laws, the defense laws in Japan. Now, many American observers believe that because of this change, Japan now can exercise the right of collective self-defense. Nothing could be further from the truth. What Japan did under Abe was to expand the realm of individual self-defense so that it began to touch the area of collective self-defense. But Japan still cannot exercise the right of collective self-defense. And the constraint is on one key point, which is the use of force. In 2015, the Japanese government did not revise the self-defense force law on the use of force. And so to this day, Japan takes the position that the use of force is only for the defense of Japan. And so this is a major perception gap between the United States and Japan. So what Japan can do is to provide rear area support, but the notion that Japan will fight side by side with the United States to defend Taiwan far exceeds the current constitutional interpretation and the laws. Japan can fight side by side with the United States to defend Japan, but not to defend Taiwan. And the other point is that the law states that if there is an attack on another country with which Japan has a close relationship, Japan might be able to support that country. But Japan does not consider Taiwan as a country. And so every official that I've spoken to with in Japan state that Japan cannot directly defend Taiwan. And so there's this major perception gap between American policymakers and policy analysts and the reality in Japan.
Lyle, was there something you wanted to add?
Well, yeah, I just wanted to follow up Mike, and that's really helpful. And I think Americans need to hear this. What the reality is. But it seems to me quite realistic to think that literally in the midst of a Taiwan crisis, various threats and maybe requests from Washington for to allow this and allow that, and we want movement of Japanese forces here. And of course, various Chinese threats. If Japan does this, then China will do this. That in the very midst of such a crisis, you might actually have a constitutional crisis in Tokyo of major proportions. Is that a reasonable forecast?
Yes, you're exactly right. I mean, in the very least, there will be a legal crisis. There have been, as I mentioned in my initial remarks, there have been many crisis simulations in Japan about a Taiwan contingency, and it's interesting that these crisis simulations have been publicized. There have been primetime television documentaries about these crisis simulations. So there's a lot of awareness about this. But one of the things that struck me about the readout of these crisis simulations, and there are books about this as well, is that those Japanese that were playing these crisis simulation games focused or preoccupied with how to classify a particular phase of the contingency, because they were concerned about the legal constraints. But if once there is a contingency, this is going to be a very rapidly evolving, free-flowing kind of contingency. But the Japanese have to figure out, is this an important influence situation? Is this an armed attack situation? Is this a survival threatening situation? Or is this a gray zone situation? And depending upon how you classify the situation, then they figure out what are the legal constraints. But I can imagine that the Americans are not going to have any patience for this. And so this is going to lead to some kind of a legal crisis. Now, what could open the way for Japan to take much more action during a crisis is if China attacks Japan. And so, interestingly, in all of these crisis simulations, the Japanese hypothesize that because of the strategic importance of the Senkakus and the strategic importance of the outermost southwest islands, the so-called Sakishima Islands, that the Chinese would attack and maybe try to seize those islands. And then the Japanese can say this is an armed attack situation, and Japan can exercise the right of individual self-defense to defend itself.
Yeah, I would just comment that based on that complication, my assessment is that China would want maximum confusion in Tokyo, and in order to get that kind of confusion, they would be willing to rule out any kind of preemptive or preventive strikes against Japanese and American bases in Japan for the very purpose that they would force Japan to more or less to take that step of intervention without to, as it were, to fire the first shot in that war. And China certainly wants Japan to be in that kind of dilemma. So I would hope that planners take this all into account. But I would think that assumption, as Mike portrayed it, that China would fire first against Japan is quite unrealistic.
All right, thank you both for that.
If I can just kind of add that, so this really puts Japan in a dilemma. And in 1960, Japan and the United States negotiated what's called the prior consultation clause. And it was not in the treaty, but it was a part of an exchange of notes. And one of the motivations, interestingly, for Japan insisting on the prior consultation was what happened in the 1958 Taiwan crisis. And the Japanese were concerned that the United States would use bases in Japan and maybe even nuclear capabilities in that 1958 crisis. So this very hawkish and nationalistic prime minister, Prime Minister Abe's grandfather, Kishi, did not want Japan to get entrapped in this Taiwan conflict. So that's the history of the prior consultation clause. And so if China, as you say, Lyle, refrains from attacking Japan, this would really put a dilemma on Japan. And there will be some that will say, well, Japan should not allow the United States to use military assets on Japan in a Taiwan scenario. And I'm sure this will divide the Japanese politic and it will cause confusion. The other possibility is that China might go after the senkakus as a diversionary tactics. And so this is something that many Japanese are thinking about, that a Taiwan scenario would also be a senkaku scenario. And so the Chinese would want the Japanese to focus on the senkaku defense and not be able to really help the United States in the Taiwan contingency. So there are two ways that it could work out in the minds of the Japanese.
If we can go off of that, we have an audience question from Andrew Jaraki about this domino theory. And Elbridge Colby recently referred to Taiwan as a canary in the coal mine, referring to Taiwan as a trampoline. And if Taiwan were to fall to China, then that would lead China to go elsewhere. What do you both think about this? Does this hold any sort of weight, especially what Professor Mochizuki was just talking about with the Senkaku Islands?
Go ahead, Mike.
Well, I think at least, I don't believe in this domino effect. There's no question that China wants to increase its influence in the Asia Pacific, and it has many other means of increasing that influence, either economically, diplomatically, and so this notion that somehow China is going to use military forces to march on to conquer other countries in East Asia, I think is something that goes way beyond what there's clear evidence for in terms of Chinese thinking.
Yeah, I also kind of reject this premise of the so-called trampoline, that China uses. I do think we can say, China's strategic position in the Asia Pacific is kind of marginally increased. I do a lot of work on submarine operations, and it would be useful to have submarine bases on Taiwan. But other than that, it really is, I think, a stretch. And the people who are making this argument really need to read up on their study of the history and the cultures of East Asia. Taiwan really is a special case. And just because, it's absolutely clear that China has designs on Taiwan, there's no question about it. And ask anybody really almost from the mainland, and you'll get the same response. Taiwan is part of China. They will not say the same thing about Japan writ large, or Taiwan, or Philippines, or Malaysia, or any other places. It's not to say there aren't some issues in those relationships, but it really is, to my mind, quite ludicrous to argue that this is the first domino. Moreover, I would also just admit that Japan itself and Philippines too are, they're both giant archipelagos that have a lot of strategic depth and are highly defensible. That's just not true with Taiwan.
Thank you so much. So kind of to wrap up, in your view, if China did invade Taiwan, what would be the prudent and recommended response from the U.S. and its allies that you advise?
Well, I'll give Mike the last word here. Again, I'm advising extreme caution. I don't rule out the fact that I understand there is a U.S. China rivalry. I understand we have to compete. It could even be that there will be military conflict. I hope dearly that will not come to pass between two nuclear superpowers. I think it can be avoided, but it may occur. But if it occurs, let it be over something of huge importance to the United States, and let it be in a place that we are confident that we can win. Neither of those conditions hold for Taiwan. This is in military parlance, this is bad ground. You do not want to try to fight China on ground that is most optimal for the Chinese PLA. Mike?
Yes, I would concur with that. If the United States is going to intervene, and there's some expectation that Japan ought to help in that cause, then it should be very cognizant of the danger of escalation, especially to the nuclear level. And therefore, I would say in the first phase of the conflict, the United States and Japan focus on kind of a defensive denial to kind of complicate China's effort to have a successful invasion, an amphibious invasion of Taiwan, and for Taiwan to resist. And it should restrain itself from attacking the mainland targets, and try to leave open the possibility of a ceasefire before there is an escalation to the nuclear level.
All right. Well, thank you both so much. I think that wraps up our discussion today. I want to, on behalf of Defense Priorities, thank both of our guests, Professor Goldstein and Professor Mochizuki, for joining us today and for sharing your insights. I certainly learned a lot, and I hope our audience did as well. On behalf of Defense Priorities, I encourage everyone watching to sign up for alerts and for future events, as well as analysis from us at defensepriorities.org. And thank you all just so much for watching and joining us today. Thank you to our guests. Thank you to our audience. This was really great.